Hello everyone and welcome to my channel, True Crime and Felines. For my returning subscribers, welcome back my feline friends. If you are new here, my name is Brandy and every Friday I bring you a true crime case or mystery with one or more of my 14 felines. I hope my videos are entertaining enough for you to stick around and subscribe and become a feline friend. Now this week's case takes place in 1922, which apparently is my favorite year for true crime. I have about 5 or 6 videos on this channel that have taken place in this same time frame. But today we're going to be talking about the Gruber family and what's known as the Hinterkaifeck murders. This case is similar to 2 other videos that I've done on the Lawson family and the Wolf family. They are similar, but I swear to you this is a different case. This case takes place in Germany, where the other 2 took place in the United States, although it happened around the same time period. Crazy, right? Anyway, let's get started. The Hinterkaifeck farmstead was built around 1863, no fighting, and was located in a small village called Grobern, which was about 43 miles from Munich, Germany. Now, it was named the Hinterkaifeck farm after Johann Hinterkaifeck, who was the owner. In 1877, Johann had actually gifted this farm to his son Joseph as a wedding gift when he married Cecilia Sonnhuter. However, in 1885, Joseph would pass away, leaving Cecilia as the sole owner of the farm. In 1886, less than a year after her husband had passed away, Cecilia would marry a farm servant who worked on the farm named Andreas Gruber. Cecilia was 9 years older than Andreas. Now, Cecilia and Andreas would end up having 3 children together, but unfortunately only one would live to adulthood, and her name was Victoria. Now, Victoria had married a man named Carl Gabriel in 1914 when she was 27 years old. Unfortunately, he shipped off to the French army in World War I and was killed in action. Victoria was pregnant when her husband was killed, and her daughter, who was also named Cecilia, but they called Celie, was born a month after her father died. Now, Victoria had another child as well, a son, in 1919. His name was Joseph, and he was 2 years old. Now, obviously, Joseph had another father, and we will get into that a bit later in the story. It's a mess, guys. They also had a maid living on the property. Yeah, they were rich. They had some money. They had a full-time maid, a live-in maid, and her name was Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Now, you know, the Gruber family had money, and they were very well off, and they were considered one of the richer families in the small village. However, Andreas was well known to be sort of a brute and had made several enemies in the village over the years. So when all this mess started, it was around September of 1921. Strange things started happening on the farm. It started out where they kept hearing sounds from the attic, like footsteps, and they would go check the attic and would never find anything. And this went on for a long time. So long, in fact, that the maid, Lorenz, had actually quit and left the house because she feared it was haunted. But it just wasn't the attic. There were other weird things happening as well. For example, Andreas had found a Munich newspaper on his property, and he didn't buy it, and neither did his family. He thought maybe the postman had lost it out of his bag. So when he approached the postman and asked him about it, the postman did not know what he was talking about and assured him that nobody around the village or even in his neighbors subscribed to that newspaper, so they didn't know where it came from. Andreas would also tell his neighbors and some friends in town that one day he discovered some footprints in the snow leading from the woods that surrounded his farm into his machine room, and there were no footprints leading back out. Now, the way this farm was built was it wasn't house, barn, machine room. It was kind of one sort of compound where everything was connected and there were doors to get into each area. So if somebody was able to break the lock of the machine room, which the lock was broke, and get in there and hide, they potentially had access to the rest of the house, including the living quarters. Around March of 1992, these strange occurrences had been going on for 6 months. The family reported that one of their key sets of keys to the house was missing. They always kept both sets of keys in the same place, and one set just went missing. And they had no idea where it was, nor did they ever find them. Now, although Andreas and his wife Cecilia would share these strange occurrences with the neighbors and friends, Andreas would still decline any help that his neighbors offered. One of his neighbors, named Lorenz Schlittenbauer, offered to let Andreas borrow his gun in order to protect the family, but Andreas refused. He was not scared of anything going on at the farm and felt he could take care of it. None of these occurrences were reported to police either. Now, Celie, Victoria's 7-year-old daughter, had gone to school the morning of March 31st, 1922, and she was very tired. When her friends asked her why she was so tired, she explained that the night before, her mother had ran off into the woods, and it took 2 hours to find her, and when they finally found her, she was crying and upset. At the time, it was unknown why Victoria had this breakdown. On the afternoon of March 31st, the new maid, Maria Baumgartner, was arriving and being dropped off by her sister. Maria had a mild intellectual disability, and she also had a physical disability where one of her legs was shorter than the other. She had a hard time finding employment due to these issues, so she was happy that the Grubers were giving her a chance. Is this going to be a thing now? You're going to jump in front of the camera every video? Now, Maria's sister would stay a while to help get Maria settled, and then she left about 6 p.m. that night. This, unfortunately, would be the last time that the family and Maria were seen alive. The next day, on April 1st, a traveling salesman, they sold coffee. They arrived at the house to take an order from the Grubers. They knocked on the door and nobody answered, and they sort of checked around the farm, didn't find anyone, so they end up just leaving. The school that little 7-year-old Celie attended noticed her absence and that there was no excuse from the family why she wasn't there. And the next day, it was noticed that the family was not at Sunday worship as well. The morning of April 4th, a man showed up. He was actually an engine repairman, and he had showed up because he had an appointment to repair an engine on some farm equipment for Andreas. He waited around the farm about an hour and did not see the family, so he was able to get into the machine room and fix the engine. He said he was there about 4 hours and he never heard anything but the farm animals and the dog barking from the barn. Later that day, around 3:30 p.m., neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer became concerned that the family had not been seen in a couple days. So he sent his son and his stepson to the Hinterkaifeck farm to check on the family. When the two boys returned unsuccessful in finding or rousing the family, Lorenz decided to go check it out himself, and he brought two other gentlemen with him. They searched the farm and end up breaking a lock in order to get into the barn. Once they entered the barn, that's where they discovered a gruesome sight. They found the bodies of Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and little Celie as well. The bodies were stacked on top of each other, and then hay and some wood from a barn door was put over them. They were all covered in blood, mostly from the head area. Now, Victoria and Cecilia were still in their workday attire. Andreas was in his sleepwear, and little Cecilia only had a shirt on and no bottoms. Lorenz started moving the bodies. He started kind of moving them and putting them aside, and when the other two gentlemen asked, "What are you doing?" he said, "I'm looking for my son, Joseph." When Joseph was not found in the barn, he then hurried through the compound into the living quarters. There's where he discovered the maid Maria and little Joseph. They were both dead as well. Little Joseph was laying dead in his bassinet, and Maria, who was still dressed in her street clothes that she came in, she hadn't even unpacked her bag yet, and she was laying dead in her bedchamber. Authorities were contacted, and the Munich Police Department began their investigation. They determined that in the evening of March 31st or the early hours of April 1st, Victoria, her daughter, Celie, Cecilia, and Andreas were lured into the barn one by one and murdered. The murder weapon was believed to be a mattock, which is like a pickaxe, due to the wounds on the bodies. Each family had wounds on their heads, in their skulls, and on their faces. Little Celie actually had her throat cut as well. They believe the perpetrator or perpetrators had then moved on from the barn into the living quarters of the farm compound. And that's where they murdered Maria as she was unpacking her bag, and then went into Victoria's bedroom where Joseph was laying in his bassinet and bludgeoned him to death with the pickaxe. Autopsies of the family were performed right there in the family barn. Even though they believed a pickaxe was the murder weapon, they were unable to find the murder weapon. It was also believed that little Celie did not die immediately after her attack. The examiner believed that she actually laid for hours after the attack and had even pulled her hair out in clumps from shock until she eventually bled out. They stated if she was found earlier, she may have been able to be saved. Now, the investigation became hindered because word spreads quickly and a lot of visitors arrived on the farm, trampling over any evidence that was left. The family's bodies had been moved by the neighbor Lorenz. Visitors had moved various items in the house or were touching things throughout the entire crime scene. And someone actually had cooked and ate a meal in the kitchen during the investigation. So yeah, there's blood and bodies everywhere, but you know what? I'm famished. Let's eat. They ended up searching the attic after the neighbors told them the stories that Andreas had been telling them over the last 6 months. And they did find 2 body prints in the hay in the attic. 2 bodies had been laying there for a while. They determined that the perpetrator or perpetrators could have been hiding inside the home for a while before they decided to act. Now, investigators first thought that the motive for these murders was robbery, but they ended up finding a large amount of money in the home that really wasn't hidden that well, jewelry and other valuable items, so that motive was pretty quickly dismissed. They also discovered that whoever did this actually stuck around the house and the farm for a few days. They knew this because the cattle had been fed, the cows had been milked, there was food missing from the pantry, an entire supply of bread was eaten, and they had recently cut meat off of some smoked meat in the pantry as well. Neighbors would also state that at least 2 days after the murders, they saw smoke coming from the chimney, so somebody was using the fireplace. So although the motive at this time was not known, a list of suspects were beginning to form and would be added to and taken away from over the next several years. So here are some of the suspects that they investigated. The first on the list was outrageously Carl Gabriel. Now, Carl Gabriel was the husband of Victoria, who had died in World War I from a shell attack in France. Now, even though he was killed in action, his body was never recovered. So the theory is that he wasn't really dead and had since abandoned the war, since everybody thought he was dead, and made his way back to the Hinterkaifeck farm to be with his family. When he realized that Victoria had a son from another man, he became enraged and ended up taking out the entire family. However, a lot of soldiers that served with Carl would come forward and say they knew he was dead, they witnessed the shell attack, and sometimes with shell attacks there's not much left of a body anyway. So that theory was quickly put to bed. Now, this is where it gets pretty interesting. I mean, interesting in a bad way. One of the suspects was Andreas Gruber himself. There was a theory that Andreas killed his family and then met his own demise via an ironic accident after the murders. This theory came from a book by the author Adolf Koppel, and the book's name is I'm probably going to butcher this, but Lear Krenstem, which translates to voice. Now, I'm going to mark in the comments down below the website that goes through this, because I do implore you to read through this page. It's very interesting, but I'm only going to list the high level evidence and circumstantial evidence that they listed here, okay? So first off, Andreas reportedly began abusing Victoria sexually when she turned 16. Now, this incestuous relationship is very well documented by court papers at the time, and it was very well known that this happened in this small village. In 1903, when Victoria was 16 years old, she reportedly told Lorenz's wife, who was the neighbor, that her father had forced himself upon her. But for whatever reason, it would be 12 years later in 1915, when Victoria was 28 years old, that a court trial actually began over this allegation. In the end, Andreas was sentenced to 1 year in prison for incest, and Victoria was sentenced to 1 month in prison for incest. Now you may ask, why was Victoria, the victim, also punished? You have to realize that back then they did a lot of victim blaming, and incest was incest in their mind. Whether she wanted to or not, it was still incest, so she had to serve her time. I know, it's kind of messed up. So Andreas served his 1-year sentence in 1915, got out in 1916. Now, 5 years later, this allegation would come up again in 1920. There was another allegation or incest charge stemming from the paternity of Victoria's 2-year-old son, Joseph. Many believed that this incestuous relationship continued and produced the son, Joseph. However, this time the court wasn't able to prove that anything really happened, and of course DNA did not exist back then to prove paternity, so the charges were ultimately dropped. Now, there were some reports that 7-year-old Celie was Andreas's daughter as well, and Victoria only married Carl Gabriel because she knew she was pregnant with her father's baby. Now, if you look at the dates, they're close, but it's not close enough to really determine who the father was. So, Carl and Victoria were married on April 3rd, 1914. Carl was then shipped off a couple months later into the army, and he ended up dying in France in December of 1914. Celie was born January 9th, 1915, so it's like 9 months, 6 days to the day that they were married. I mean, it could go either way, guys, because Victoria never moved away from the farm once she married Carl. Carl moved in with the family. So, now, this book goes on to believe that Andreas was the killer, and here's the evidence and the circumstantial evidence that they list. So Andreas was known to demand obedience from his family, and if they didn't do what he said, he pretty much beat them into submission, to the point where neighbors wanted to report him for child abuse, but became afraid of him. There were reports that he would withhold food from his children as punishment, and if they were really bad, he would lock them in the cellar over the winter months when it was bitterly cold down there. Now, remember, Cecilia and Andreas had 3 children, but only Victoria survived to adulthood. The book suggests that one of their daughters, Sophie, was punished by being put in the basement over winter, and that's how she died. She froze to death. So then, remember Victoria, the night before the murders, had ran into the woods, and it took her 2 hours and they found her crying? Well, it's believed that Victoria had finally kind of snapped over everything and the sexual assaults and abuse and whatever, and decided to leave the farm with her children for good to get away from her father. However, Andreas was not happy about this and had threatened to kill her. So, upset, she ran off into the woods not knowing what to do. Now, we know that Andreas was very possessive over Victoria for obvious reasons, and it was noted that Victoria had strangulation marks on her neck when her body was found, which that shows more of an emotional type killing before being struck with the pickaxe. There's also a theory in the book that suggests that it wasn't really Victoria that Andreas was upset with. It was a desire over his granddaughter, maybe daughter as well, 7-year-old Celie, that he was pretty much attracted to young girls, and that he had started abusing Celie as well, and that this whole massacre took place because the family was trying to save Celie. that Andreas had pulled Celie into the barn in order to assault her, and the family either found out or rallied around her to save her, and Andreas snapped and just grabbed the pickaxe, which was kept in the barn, and took everybody out. Then he either assaulted or attempted to assault Celie, which would explain why she had no bottoms on when she was found, and out of frustration, he ended up cutting her throat with his pocket knife. So allegedly, after the family was killed, Andreas really didn't know what to do, so he just went on the next couple days doing what he always did and took care of the farm, which explains why the cattle was fed, the cows were milked, the fire was going in the fireplace, and the food was being eaten. What the book says is that Andreas met his ultimate demise by accident. That he went into the barn to probably take care of the bodies, to either try to hide them or get rid of them. And he slipped and fell, and his head and face would hit a heavy pickaxe, like a pitchfork, and would go through his carotid artery, killing him instantly. And then when he fell to the side, it pretty much tore off part of his face. His skin had been pulled away and his skull was showing. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad theory, because the evidence and the circumstantial evidence, they do kind of lead up to a lot of this and fill in some holes that, a lot of questions that people had. But in my research, what the biggest hole I found is that nowhere is this pitchfork mentioned. And it's also mentioned in other research in multiple sites that I've read that Andreas, they talk about his face kind of being gone, but he also had wounds to his skull as well. Like somebody used the pickaxe on him as well. So obviously he's not going to pickaxe himself to commit suicide. So, that's the only reason why I just thought, it doesn't really add up. So that's the theory of Andreas Gruber doing it. Now the next suspect was the neighbor Lorenz Schlittenbauer. Now it was rumored that when Lorenz's first wife had died in 1918, that he immediately began a torrid affair with Victoria, like literally 2 weeks later after his wife died. And he's also rumored to be the potential father of 2-year-old Joseph. Now, Lorenz would state that when his wife died, Victoria pretty much imposed herself on him, and he couldn't resist. And they had sex at least 5 times. Now, Lorenz stated that he wanted to marry Victoria, especially after she told him that she was pregnant. But Andreas strictly refused. Now, the 2 gentlemen that came with Lorenz when they were looking for the family and discovered the bodies stated that Lorenz had some strange behavior during and after the bodies were found. The 2 gentlemen that he came with would state that when the bodies were found in the barn, Lorenz really wasn't shocked or disgusted, and he just right away started moving the bodies one by one and going through the pile. Now again, when he was asked why he was doing this, he stated he was looking for his son, Joseph. When he didn't find Joseph in the barn, he headed to the living quarters. The 2 men stated that they had to break a lock to get into the barn, but that when they got to the living quarters, Lorenz had a key and just opened the living quarters and went into the house. So was this the missing keys, or did Lorenz just have a key, being a friendly neighbor? Now, Lorenz had asthma, and authorities kind of ruled him out, saying that there's no way he could have done this, and there was no evidence that he was there at the farm either. However, locals kept coming back to Lorenz, probably 1 out of desperation to find the killer, but 2, they stated that he would make comments that maybe only the perpetrator would know. So for example, he had stated that the perpetrator or goal was to bury the bodies in the floor of the barn. But the frozen ground had hindered that plan. But there was an obvious attempt noted in the investigation that somebody tried to dig into the ground in the barn because there was a small indentation and a shovel. Locals also would state that their theory is that Victoria had finally came to Lorenz and demanded, child support for Joseph. And Joseph had a problem with the paternity because Victoria had admitted to him that she was having sex with her father again, and he wasn't going to pay for somebody who wasn't his son, so he ended up just murdering the whole family. Now, these next suspects were brought up by various people, but a woman named Teresa had wrote a letter years after the murders citing that when she was 12 years old, these two men, which were named Carl and Andreas, not Carl Gabriel, not Andreas Gruber, these are just two different guys altogether. They visited her mother, and in the course of the conversation, Teresa stated that her mother had stated a comment saying Andreas regretted that he lost his pocket knife in the barn. Now, when the farm was demolished in 1923, they did find a pocket knife, which was believed to be the weapon that cut Seeley's throat. But this lead produced no new breaks in the case. So remember Lorenz Schlittenbauer? She was the maid that quit back in September 1921 because she thought the house was haunted. Now, when she was questioned, she came up with two stories. The first one was that she blamed the Bickler brothers. She stated that the Bickler brothers had helped the Grubers with a lot of harvest, so they knew the farm very well. She also stated that late at night, a man would stand outside her window and talk to her, and she believed it to be one of the Bickler brothers. She also stated that the Bickler brothers were friends with the man called George Siegel. George Siegel had also worked on the farm and was aware of the family's fortune, and I guess talked about it a lot. Now, George had been accused a year and a half before the murders of breaking into the Gruber's home and stealing some items, but George had always denied that he did this. So Lorenz said that that would make sense that the three of them maybe worked together. But then later, she would blame another set of brothers, the Thayer Brothers. Now, apparently, these brothers were well known of committing various minor crimes around the village, so they were well-known criminals, apparently. Now, Lorenz would say that she witnessed one of the brothers scouting out the farm one time, and he was with a stranger, which she assumed was his brother. She also stated that one of the brothers would stand outside her window at night and ask her questions about the family, which she refused to answer. So which is it, Lorenz? Were you talking to the Bickler brother or were you talking to the Thayer brother? Either way, a man standing outside your window at night wanting to talk to you is creepy. Just knowing that she has these two stories, it just makes me think that she knew more than what she was saying, and that she didn't leave the farm because she thought it was haunted. She left the farm because she knew what was going to happen. Just my opinion. Now, in 2017, Bill James, who was the author of the book The Man from the Train. If you have not read this book, I highly recommend it. He alleges that Paul Mueller, who was a German immigrant, could have been responsible for the Hinterkaifeck murders. Now, according to the book, Paul had used the train's tracks around the United States to commit various murders. The book alleges that Paul had killed two families in a single night in Colorado, and then rode the train up to Kansas City a few weeks later, killed a family there, and then a few weeks after that ended up in Iowa and killed a family there. The famous Villisca Axe murder house case. Because after the Moore family in Villisca had been murdered, the murders around those, Midwestern states had just stopped. And in the book, they stated that Paul realized authorities were catching on to his pattern of killings. So he went back to his home country of Germany, and he was said to be in the area of Hinterkaifeck farm at the time of the murders. Interesting theory. The family was buried in the Wadehofen Cemetery on April 8th, 1922, to a crowd of over 3,000 people. I'm telling you guys, true crime brings out the crowds even back then. In February of 1923, the farm was demolished because nobody wanted to live there. And in the midst of this demolishment, they found the pickaxe murder weapon. It was hidden between the floor of the attic and the kitchen. And in the midst of demolishing the barn, they found the pocket knife. So since the farm was demolished close to where the farm was, there is now a shrine dedicated to the family. Lorenz Schlittenbauer, the neighbor, had passed away in 1941. However, ever since the murders up to his death, he had conducted and won several civil lawsuits against people that would accuse him of being the murderer of Hinterkaifeck farm. In 2007, the Furstenfeldbruck Police Academy would take this case on as a cold case. Even though the academy was conclusively unable to 100% solve the case, they were able to state that they ruled out all the suspects but one, and devised a theory of what really happened that night. Unfortunately, the Academy has kept this private out of respect of the suspect's family that are still living. So this case is officially still considered unsolved. Maybe one day we'll get to see what is in that Academy's files. So who do you think did these murders? Do you think it was Andreas and then the universe decided to enact a bit of karma on him? Was it really Paul Mueller in a sadistic killing spree? I would love to know what you think in the comments down below. If you would like to become a feline friend, please hit that subscribe button, and we will be back next week. I'm missing a cat. Next Friday with another true crime case or mystery. Thanks for sticking around, guys. I really appreciate it. Bye.